Hello, everyone. Last night I renamed this presentation. I renamed it Don't Panic, and I realized it looks like a note to self. So, but no, hopefully it will make sense soon. I'm Tessa Quinn. I work for Scottish Government. You may guess that from the slides. We have to use these. But I've been there for 5 years. I joined in the middle of COVID, and I joined because I wanted to do big things that mattered. So quite a lot to do during COVID, but even I wasn't prepared for what happened when the Ukraine crisis started. So the point of this talk, I am going to talk about my experience leading the digital design and data program for the Ukraine response. And I'm going to talk about what we learned. But the reason I'm doing that is not to tell you how brilliant I was or how brilliant the team were, although the latter is definitely true. The reason that we realized that it was important to start talking about this was that although it was a very extreme situation, and it was, and it tested many standard delivery practices, we definitely bent many of them. But in hindsight, it was very clear that it was a very good microcosm of the kind of transformation journey. It was done at pace, it was done a bit strangely, but we definitely realized the lessons we learned from it were really important to talk about. And we definitely learned them from mistakes as well as our successes. And by all means, feel free to ask me later about which ones we learned from failures and which ones we learned from success. But both were critical. Okay, so I'm sure most of you will remember February 2022 when Putin ordered 200,000 troops into Ukraine for what he called a special military operation, but what governments started calling very quickly an illegal invasion. I remember it particularly strongly because my husband's best friend lives in Kiev with his family, and they were on the phone all the time, and they could hear bombs. So it's not something that I ever thought I would experience in my lifetime, and I think a lot of people felt the same. This illegal invasion resulted very quickly in what at the time was the largest displacement of people since World War II. Whether that's true now, I'm not sure. And those people were mainly women and children. And that happened very quickly. And all governments, at least in Europe, wanted to help. And again, the international response was very quick. And Scotland, the ministers unanimously, and they don't often think unanimously about things, wanted to provide sanctuary. But what did that mean? Well, Nicola Sturgeon, and this is the only slide I will read out, I promise. Nicola Sturgeon said, "On behalf of the Scottish Government and the people of Scotland, I warmly welcome you and your family and friends to Scotland. I want you to know you are now safe." Can you imagine not feeling safe in that way? "Please know that you will be treated with care, dignity and respect for however long you stay. We have been shocked by what's happened to the people of Ukraine, and we want to help, to provide you the support and the services that you need. As we open our doors to you, we also open our hearts. We offer not just refuge, but a warm Scottish welcome and a nation of helping hands to you and your loved ones. Welcome to Scotland, our home, and for as long as you need it, yours too." And I have to say that wasn't rhetoric. The whole of government felt the same way, and people jumped in to help all over the place. Problem was, we didn't know what it involved, and we didn't know how to do it. So one of the things that was different, and apologies if you all know this, but Scottish Government made one change to what UK Government and other nations were doing, where the UK Government response was that Ukrainians would be offered a temporary visa on the basis of them having a sponsor. It could be a sponsor that was family or a sponsor that are strangers that they'd found on Facebook, but there was a named sponsor who gave them accommodation. The Scottish Government chose to act as the sponsor. So the Scottish Government said they would give accommodation and for the number of people arriving. So that was a significant difference. And when you talk about, whether we needed our own systems or whatever, that fundamental difference meant we had to have a very, very different type of response. That promise came as well as accommodation. There was also welcome triage, which meant people from Ukraine could phone and get into call centres, be advised on travel arrangements, being advised on health arrangements. We had people coming with dialysis needs, etc. And there was also 24-hour support offered. This was also not just offered by Scottish Government. This was offered by local authorities. This was offered by the third sector. This was offered by NHS. So it was a real kind of public service-wide response. So the focus for this response, and bear in mind at the time that the figure Nicola Sturgeon mentioned was 3,000 people. Now we were told that 3,000 people is what we would expect, but we weren't going to put a cap on it. Scotland doesn't have a lot of refugees. We're kind of the people hit England first and don't get much further up. So the numbers, even like Syrian refugees and other crises, were in the single figures, or maybe double. But 3,000 was like nothing Scotland had ever dealt with before. So the key focus, and the idea is almost immediately these schemes opened, the applications into them were huge. And what Ukrainians were doing was applying to every country, so to see who offered it. But we had no idea of how many of these people would turn up. But we needed a place for them to stay. So that's where all the kind of emphasis of the programme went. At the peak of new arrivals, we had hundreds arriving every day. And the logistics of trying to get them in and settled and places to stay were unfathomable. And we ended up at the peak with over 7,000 people in welcome accommodation. Welcome accommodation was hotels and cruise ships. So, and the operational devices we had to use to try and get that kind of accommodation at short notice in Scotland, also during the Edinburgh Festival, was no mean feat. But, and overall, more than that says 25,000, 29,000 people arrived into Scotland, which is, not that we're boasting, more than any head of the population for any other UK nation. It's a lot of people, and guess what? We didn't have enough accommodation. So, but this was beginning to happen, February, March. But the situation, as I said, there hadn't been anything of any scale that had happened like this before. And as much, and I absolutely admire and agree with Nicola Sturgeon's promise, it was the right thing to do. The digital maturity was low. And I say nothing was built for scale. The actual system for a resettlement in Scotland was a single spreadsheet and 2 part-time staff. So, and it worked fine. They just shouted over the office to each other, But we were talking about bringing 50 temporary staff in to help find people places to stay. That wasn't going to work on the spreadsheet. So, we also had multiple delivery stakeholders. So I said local authorities. We had COSLA, who's the Convention of Local Authorities. we had health, we had many other people. So charity, third sector, Scottish Refugee Council, etc. So the other thing is that we had no team. There wasn't a team sitting there waiting to pick this stuff up. So volunteers were asked for across government, and volunteers kind of flooded in all disciplines, policy people, DDs. There were about 6 DDs, for non-government people, deputy directors. So we had a plethora of deputy directors at one point, but no service designer. So, you know, it was, a very unbalanced kind of workforce. And it was a very rapidly evolving situation. There was no way the needs could be known. And the phrase I often throw about this is, there was no playbook, you know, and people didn't know what to do. And there was extreme urgency. As I said, the second these temporary visa application systems opened, you know, it was absolutely inundated. This call centre that was run by the NHS, following on from the COVID call centre, we commandeered that. They managed to deal with these like hundreds of calls. And the other thing is, it was a war. The data that we were dealing with, or we are dealing with, was very desirable by a nation that wished harm to the people we had the data on. So again, this is not a situation that we had dealt with. So the digital landscape was tricky, to say the least. So around this time, I got a call from my old boss. I used to work on the COVID stuff, as I said, and I got a call from him, and he was asking for some advice about what was happening, the digital part of it, which I gave him, and he was like, "Oh, it's terrible, Tessa. You really don't want to get involved in this. It's awful." And I was like, "Okay, fine." He phoned me up the next day saying, "You know what I said?" So yes, I got asked to join and try and help sort it out. And of course, I'm an idiot, so I said yes. So I don't know if you'd can think about what you'd feel like in that situation. Maybe some of you have worked in these situations. But this is what I felt like. Yeah. And absolutely, I was terrified, you know, and I was terrified for a good 2 weeks, I'd say, you know, like cold sweats at night and not having a clue. Again, if you've worked in government, you'll know that we have acronym disease. And it was all new acronyms, and I had no idea what we were trying to do. And I had no idea where to start. But I started thinking, okay, first things first, I need a plan, I need to work this out. Then I needed to gain some trust. It was very clear that these different organizations, these delivery, didn't understand each other, didn't understand each other's needs. And already, because everyone was really stressed and tense and scared, you know, things were not good. I also needed a team. I needed a team that included a service designer and not 4 deputy directors. I needed the right kind of people. Do you know, sometimes the volunteers were people who had been volunteered. So, or the volunteers were people that liked order and certainty and things like that. So I needed a team that had the right skills. And then I needed to know what the now problems were. This wasn't stuff that you could plan for. So it was like the problem was there in front of you. So I just had to do the next thing. So that kind of after 2 weeks meant at least I could breathe and eat again. So the first stuff that we had to do, and don't worry about reading this, it's mainly for my benefit, but it does mean you don't have to take notes. Everything was tactical. So again, talking about the issue is now, we had people coming in. We had data coming from the Home Office. We didn't know how to process it. So we used existing technology. The first solution was stood up in 2 weeks. It was horrible, but it was there. We used, for suppliers, we used existing contracts, we begged, borrowed, stole, I think, probably. We were very creative and pragmatic about what we sourced. Honestly, we had a service designer that had the most unbelievable idea about how to use Teams, and it worked. Never to be repeated, I have to say. And we looked at things like cloud solutions and low-code platforms. But coming talk about tactical, low-code platforms, there's lots of different ones about there, but we went for Microsoft Power Apps because there was a Microsoft Power Apps developer, and that was the only reason we needed. You know, we needed the person as well as the tool. So we fixed short-term problems, we put in processes that made things work. Coming back to, I think, Rochelle's talk, I don't know if anyone was at it, but she was talking about how people make these crazy things work. Well, there was a lot of people making crazy things work in this situation. So what we ended up creating tactically was this very complicated, and that's the nicest word I could think about calling it, patchwork of operations, which was largely manual. So we had volunteers from across government, again, cutting data from spreadsheets and putting it in secure folders for other people to cut other data from spreadsheets. So this resulted in a data architecture, a data flow that looked largely like this. So one of my, the statisticians that worked with us said, we're living in chewing gum and prayers. And yeah, that was pretty much the situation. So having said that, although that was the infrastructure, the data flows, on top of that was something that worked. So, and this is a direct quote from Lorraine Cook, who we spent 2 years working hand in hand together. Again, Scottish Government and COSLA don't always have the best relations, but we made this work and became firm allies. And this is something that she said, was that as the numbers of people arriving started to increase, we were buckling under the sheer scale of data. You worked with our matching team, got a real understanding of what we were doing, and created a system that worked. So coming back to needing to get trust, do you know, so when I saw that quote, which Lorraine told us through a thank you video that COSLA sent us, you know, was really important to me. So the strategic response, which I thought we would do weeks after standing up the tactical, doesn't work like that, because that spaghetti diagram, you have to maintain that. It's insane. But we did continue thinking about what the strategic response should be. Again, we had no idea if the war would be over in a matter of weeks, or, as it has turned out, years. But we knew that chewing gum and prayers wasn't going to last forever. So we needed to do something at the same time that was more strategic. Our user researchers became trauma trained, and we actually managed to have a kind of program of working with the displaced people into their needs, which again, there was no way for understanding what those needs were before the people arrived. But we also had to be very, very careful about how we talked to people. We used a flexible procurement. The reason I'm laughing is I don't know if any of you have ever tried to speak to a procurement manager and said, I don't know what I want, I don't know how long I want it for, and I don't know how much money I've got. So, but again, they were heroes and we managed to do it. We recruited people, we got these kind of low-code platforms in, and we ended up creating a digital ecosystem, all underpinned by a data platform. And this is something that had been learned through COVID. If you had the data platform underneath, you could actually kind of spin up these applications really quickly. And if it was a different application needed, you could spin that up really quickly. So it gave you a really kind of flexible way of doing things. So the idea was that we would have secure data, which we did, that we would also improve the operations and improve our understanding of the situation. We needed to know where people were and what they needed. So that turned the spaghetti into this. So you can tell a data architect did not do this diagram. I did this diagram, so that's why it's pretty. So, but yes, it was farmer ordered. There was still a lot of data flying about the place, but it was automated, and we knew why it was flying about the place, and it was the right type of data. So our whole process, and this was not overnight, this took us 2 years to complete. So 8 weeks to get the first application up and running, well, 2 weeks to get the first solution up and running, 8 weeks to get the first application up and running, and 2 years to get to this state. But it was a fully fledged ecosystem that all the data flows were automated and secure. So go us. But so bring things up to date. Last year, the team left work in Ukraine and moved on to other things. The idea is that we had built the infrastructure, was there. The Ukraine team could now run it themselves. The war continues. And the Ukraine directorate, Scotland's Ukraine directorate, stood down. There are now, in the last year, this has happened, no Ukrainians residing in welcome accommodation. They are all settled in homes or still with hosts. And the policies across UK governments, UK nations, are now aligned. So Scotland paused the super sponsor scheme when we realised there was nowhere to put people, and the policies are now the same. We conducted an options appraisal in February 2025, including talking to the UK government about their plans. And we concluded they were building an in-house system at that point, that actually it would make much more sense for Scotland to jump onto their system when it was built, and inform the building of it and making sure it was fit for our purpose. And UK government were delighted to do that. So the system share was built in-house by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I had to write that for my benefit. So that system's now live. Scotland and Wales have onboarded onto that system, and we closed our ecosystem, our beautiful picture, closed down a couple of months ago. And we're having a drink next month to celebrate. And that change has meant that there's huge savings and reduction of duplication. So, and I have to say, UK government have done a marvellous job. So this is their demo site. It's a lot prettier and a lot easier to use than what we built, I have to say. I always called our kind of solutions like our ugly children. So we loved them, but they were ugly. And this is the current day solution that is helping local authorities across the country. So that's the story of what happened. What that resulted in, these systems, is that almost 50,000 visa applications were dealt with. Coming back to the 10 a year, that's pretty impressive. And over 29,000 Ukrainians settled in Scotland, whether it was temporary or on a longer term. The guests, we had 20,000 people offer to host accommodation in Scotland. And the initial kind of call, and I'm sure everyone remembers that, people going, can you put people up? From that, with other accommodation, 11,000 people from Ukraine were settled in these hosted accommodations. The system itself managed to process over 3,000 of those. And the solution that we developed to get more people to host accommodation, and this is where you talk about the kind of digitization versus digitalization, we managed to chop 27 days out the processing time by just building a better process. So, but again, that spaghetti junction that you saw takes a lot of time. And 30 local authorities were onboarded using it, which is 93%, so 2 didn't. So, and we had workarounds for those 2. But again, if anybody has worked, getting that number of local authorities using one system was a pretty amazing achievement. The legacy outcomes, again, you know, a year on from those figures, what we found we had was reusable program methodologies. You know, I spent a lot of time going, is there a way we do this? And getting told no. So there's now a way we do this. We got a team of incredibly high-performing staff. If you've done this, you can do anything. And we also got amazing cross-sectoral partnerships, and that comes back to something that Rochelle was talking about in her talk again, is that sometimes it's okay if it's the relationships that you built, and what we have found is absolutely we built that trust, and that's still coming in today. I'm still contacted to give advice and things that are nothing to do with me, because we built those relationships and trust. And we've got some digital tools to tackle this in a future crisis, whether it's built by UK government or by Scottish government. And the most important thing that I think we have got from this is what we learned. So, what did we learn? We learned that it's easy to get people onto cruise ships, but not so easy to get them off cruise ships. Maybe depends if you've got a virus to help you, I don't know, but topical. But yes, many things we learned. But these are the things we learned, particularly from a technology perspective or a digital perspective. And the first one, again, none of these are rocket science, but the whole thing about it being a microcosm is we learned this at pace, and I'll stand by every element of this. So stabilize your data before building on it. So that spaghetti junction that we ended up with was horrific, and it took so many man hours to maintain that. It was very, very hard to fix it. So that's why it took 2 years. If there's anything I could do again, I would try and focus on that. We couldn't, we had people coming, but I would try and do something better there. Data security is absolutely paramount, but often overlooked. And yeah, I had to get quite ferocious at some points what was happening with data. And people just didn't realize what they were doing was a risk. It's just not understood. And that data is required for operations and decision making. And that's not always understood. And again, particularly by senior leaders, they understood they needed statistics and predictions and all these things. They didn't understand that the guy at the welcome desk needed to know who was coming. So again, I think there were things, just data particularly. I don't know if you know, like 10 years ago, if somebody said I work in digital, people would freak out and go, I don't do digital. Well, I think they're now doing that with data. So we actually also found that because people were scared of data, they just kind of went, I became the data person. Oh, Tessa will deal with that. You know, Tessa knows that. I was like, it's your data. You have to understand it. You have to protect it. So, expect change. So, I mean, we really had to expect change. We kept our scope really tight and then iterated. I remember my business analyst saying to me, is like, I feel like the champion of mediocrity. And he was indeed, at that point, the champion of mediocrity. But we had to get something out there that worked. And then we started putting value into it. These are things I've often talked about, the whole MVP thing, and it's like, well, actually, that really was an MVP, and we really did iterate. So again, coming back to this, sometimes it was putting a lot of theory into practice in a way you don't do in normal situations. And design for change, so coming back to that data platform, we knew we couldn't build a massive system because it would become redundant with one single policy change. And so we made sure that we knew we could be flexible. I think the next bullet point is really important. And somebody at some point, when I was probably having a meltdown quietly in a corner, said to me, it's okay if it's the wrong, if the decision's not right. You just have to make sure it's not wrong. And that's a very different thing. And I think another way that people talk about is A decisions and B decisions. It's like B decisions will do. You know, they're ones that you can rectify if it turns out to be the wrong decision. A decisions you have to really kind of get right. But don't spend all your time and effort in that B decision space. And yeah, again, to my poor BAs, trying to map this as-is journey when it was changing hourly was a waste of time. So we actually mapped much higher level, at a service level. And people didn't look into the detail of the diagrams anyway. So, and then the quote that my dad many times quoted at a slightly perfectionist, judgmental teenager, "The perfect is the enemy of the good," is a phrase that I kind of ended up putting a lot of store into, and my team heard it many times. It's like, that'll do. Get it out there, get it working. So, the next lesson was that people will help, and I cannot stress how amazing the people of Scotland and the UK have been to support Ukrainians. Again, coming back to 20,000 people offering their homes. I know somebody who's still got Ukrainians in their house, 4 years on. Do you know, they don't even like them very much, do you know? But they're there, do you know? And that's a story that goes across all the nations, absolutely. But I've said, joked before, I have no shame. I will ask people for anything. I definitely ask people for anything. So I got given staff, I got given budgets, I got given moral support. There was a situation where everybody was keen to help. And the delivery partners joined forces. There were definitely times when the shit hit the fan and things had to be sorted, and we all got together and we found ways to make it work. And those are some of the best moments you can ever have in a career. And it was amazing. I would say one thing particularly is remember to thank people if they've done that for you, and pay it back when it's your turn. So I'm still paying a lot of favours back. Is this one of them? No, I don't think so. Again, I think there's a lot of service designers, users, research here. So preaching to the converted, but the users were everything, and the Ukrainians were everything. There were lots of assumptions made. There were lots of anecdotes. So a minister would talk to one Ukrainian and think that's what was the position of all Ukrainians and things like that. So the user research that we conducted was vital. And again, because people were so desperate to help, those anecdotes were taken out of context. I would say I think it's making your user research agile and actionable. There was no time to do a 12-week kind of piece of work. I wanted to know what I needed to do, in a week. And that definitely put a lot of stress on my user researchers. But there was stuff, it's like, just spit out what you know. So I think that agile, actionable user research is a good practice. And I'm still annoying user researchers, so. Obviously, ethics policy, trauma reform practice, again, vital for anything. But just kind of put a focus on that. I think this is something, and again, somebody was asking in another session about were policy involved. I have to say, we worked really closely with policy. And we actually had an ongoing user research that supported the policy development as well as the digital tools and operational development. So I'm not saying that's going to be replicated, but we managed to do it for this, and it was hugely beneficial. For example, there was research into why Ukrainians weren't leaving the welcome accommodation. And it wasn't just because it was free and it was comfy. A lot of them were just wanting to go home, so they didn't want to make a permanent home in Scotland. Do you know? And the other thing is, like, there was great communities built up in these hotels and cruise ships, and community was really important to them in this time of crisis and stress and trauma. So yeah, there was things that we had maybe not understood. And and if you can't do everything, and you definitely can't, pick the things with impact, pick the big problems. And again, there's no user researcher or service designer that doesn't know this, but users don't do what you think. And one of my favorite quotes was somebody had been working in a local authority and came back and said, there was an audacious application of functionality. And I think we can all imagine, or we've all seen those audacious applications. Stakeholders matter. Those trusted relationships were crucial. Okay. And adoption is hard. So I think that's the thing, that you build something, but getting people to use it is really, really tough. But again, those partnerships and all the other things really worked in that. But the most important thing was getting the team right. And by that I mean getting the right skills, that I've talked about before, but the temperament of the people that can deal with chaos. There's actually people who enjoy chaos. I might be one of them. But that was absolutely critical, making suppliers part of the team. And my job was creating the space for the team. So shield them from distraction, allowing them to perform. So, and find time and ways for them to bond. This is my team rock pooling on North Berwick Beach. This wasn't at the middle of the crisis, I have to say. It was towards the tail end. But I did try and make sure, despite how stressful things were, there were times that they could have some space and find out more about each other. I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to zoom through these. Psychological safety. This kind of steps 1 to 5 align vaguely to Susan Whelan's integrated model of group development. But it's a build on Tuckman's storming, norming, reforming thing. But the whole point is that the psychological safety grew, and it grew in my team. And that safety brings magic. And that safety means your team members excel. And I think that's the most important thing, and that's what we did. Gary said, I've worked for the civil service for 40 years. This is the hardest work I've ever done, the most rewarding, and the most supported I've ever felt. This is the same Gary who, when I said, can you explain what your job is now? He said, still slaving for the boss, which is me. So, and the team reflections, I'm going to skip over that. But the quickest story I want to tell is that that team that was built in these circumstances, Christmas Eve, everyone was off, I was on call. 9:15, I got a call. There was a problem in the data system. There was weird data appearing. And when I say weird data, I mean really weird data. So I contacted the supplier, looked into some of the issues. Next 15 minutes, I'd asked the lead engineer to come back in. We made investigations. At 11 o'clock, there was a meeting with the supplier and the few people who were in. Suddenly, all my leads had appeared on that call, including one of them phoning from Santa's Grotto. By 12:30, the entire team had come back in, and not a single one of them had been asked on Christmas Eve. And by 3 o'clock, the issue was resolved. So that's what happened with the team. So the one thing I want you to remember is, if you look after your team and work at it, make them feel safe, they will look after you and each other when it counts. And don't panic.
Thank you, Tessa. Amazing case study. We might have time for one quick question, if there is one. If there is a question. Oh, Kat's got it. Great.
Hi, Tessa. Oh,
Hello.
my voice sounds like loud. Can you just remind me, what was your job title? What's your job role?
My job title for this was Programme Director. So I was the Programme Director for the design, digital and data parts of the programme. So I'm now the service owner for public service teams doing digital things.
Okay. And I just wanted to say that someone with that role coming up and saying all the things you've just said is absolutely amazing, and I wish we had more of that in the government transformation stuff we did. So thank you very much for coming up here and being candid and sharing all that. I thought it was brilliant.